Okay. So this is the archaeology of the First World War. And we're going to look at the Somme, and we're going to look at Messines Ridge. Somme is in France, for those that know, and Messines Ridge is in Belgium. One event takes place in 1916, the other takes place in 1917. And I found doing this lecture, it's been quite emotive, because I've been finding that people have got links through their generations with the First World War. After all, the First World War, up until 10 years ago, was still a memory from those that actually fought in the First World War. Mainly men, but there were lots of women who fought as well. And we've got to think about the loss of life in regards to the hundreds of thousands of horses that were killed. You could look at carrier pigeons and dogs and all the rest of it. But whilst we even paint this, and I know one or two of you have already said to me they're going to find this lecture very difficult to deal with, I think it's a poignant lecture that takes us to a point in time that we can associate with. At Messines Ridge, a ridge that was established as a front line from as early as 1914, we look at the Messines Ridge as a site that today there are 19 large craters dotted the landscape in Belgium. And these large craters themselves, in many parts, are the only memorial to the sacrifice of 8 million men and women that died on the Western Front in the First World War. And is this going to be a historical lecture or an archaeological lecture? Well, this is going to be an archaeological lecture, but obviously to paint the picture, we've got to look at the history. And in lots of ways, the archaeology can be said to be the only sense of a timeline to understand the historical references. Up until 2000, the First World War was still a memory, but it was something that was not dramatized, was not something that many films were made about. We'll talk about Hair of the Wind, which was an Academy winning film. We can look at one or two other films from the First World War, but other than that, nobody really bothered with taking up the subject and telling people how terrible it was. And after 2000, it almost seems as if the interest in the First World War explodes, and that's not a pun at all. We start to see some of the veterans talking about it. We start to see series, and we start to see various films. And the one with David Jason and Gallipoli would be the one that springs to mind. But since then, many films have been made about it, and we've already passed the 100th anniversary, and we've already passed the 100th anniversary of the start of the First World War. My grandmother was born in 1918, and my granddad was born in 1914. And I do have one story that I will tell you about a certain Sergeant Williams, who was my great-great-granddad who fought in the First World War. And he went back, and he went back. And I've only got one story that I can tell you about him. Yesterday, I was quite choked to hear that I've got my young explorers on a Wednesday afternoon, and both of them had stories about the First World War, and it was quite a somber lecture. This crater, one of these 19 craters at Messines Ridge, you used to be able to haul out human limbs from the side of this crater up until a few years ago. And scattered across the battlefields of France, the border with Russia, you're looking at the Balkans, you're looking at Iraq and Africa, and also China and Japan, and one or two other flashpoints. This was truly a world war. I've also tried to link these lectures in, and I don't know how I've done it, into the current pandemic. And I will remind you all that the pandemic of 1918, 19, 20, 21 was a pandemic that it said claimed at least 50 million lives. Some say 100 million. And there's so many parallels associated with that pandemic and today. And those parallels can only be categorized with what happened to our Prime Minister a few months ago. He suddenly put us into lockdown. It seemed that everything seemed to be running smoothly. He ended up with the virus. He nearly died. And the same thing can be said with Lloyd George, that the pandemic hit Britain in towards the end of 1918. And Lloyd George came down with a pandemic and nearly died. And what happened to the Germans and the peace treaty and everything else was down to the absence of Lloyd George. And that then eventually led to the Second World War and all the other wars that we've had since. I know that sounds like a sweeping statement, but the parallels with the past are quite stark. What we can see here is a number of rounds associated with Messines Ridge. And it may surprise some of you, and Keith will agree with me on this, that there are conflicts that we are told about in the written history, but when you look at the archaeology, the conflict looks to be different than the written record. And also, we find that other events have happened and they've not been recorded. And what I'm talking about, with the archaeological excavations at Messines Ridge in 2018, 2 years ago, at Messines Ridge, they identified another large battle, and not just the one that we're going to look at in regards to the events of 1917. So they identified a completely new battle at Messines Ridge. And it was down to these cartridges. These are German cartridges, and the dates on these cartridges were 1914. They could not have been used in 1916 or 1917 because the cordite in regards to these rounds starts to go into a liquid form after a very short period of time. Probably made at the Spandau factory just outside Berlin, and the problem is you can't fire these rounds any more than a year later. That indicates clearly that there had been a large battle at Messines Ridge that was not recorded. They just didn't dig the trenches. And we see in the archaeology some events that were not recorded in the history. And I'm surprised if Keith tells me that he hasn't got one of these.
I've got a later one.
I call them the Wickelpinkel helmets. And obviously, these were typical of the early part of the First World War, used by the German infantry, cavalry officers, and obviously the Austrians as well. They found examples of these at Messines Ridge, obviously indicating that these were part of the 1914 battle that was unidentified. Because by the time you get to late 1915, 1916, these are not used because of the little thing that sticks out on the helmet, that you can actually, the Allies and the Entente powers could actually see you, so they got away with these quite garish things. And one thing that I'm going to tell you as we look at the archaeology now, before I actually go to my notes, is a little story associated with my great-great-granddad from the First World War. It's quite a strange little story, and you're not going to see the link, but there is a link. So I was told by my grandmother that her father, Sergeant Williams, in the First World War, in 1914, he was in the trenches alongside the Belgians. So this was obviously somewhere around Messines Ridge. And it said that a German officer comes towards the trench with one of these helmets on. And he's coming towards the trenches, and he's all alone. And they're wondering what to do with this German officer. And this Belgian bloke jumped out of the trench and shot this German officer off his horse. And he ran towards the German officer, and my relative, Sergeant Williams, was thinking, what is he doing? You know, the officer's now off his horse. You know, we've got to do something to help the officer. As the officer's writhing on the ground, the Belgian soldier cuts the German officer's fingers off because he's got gold rings on them. And my Sergeant Williams has got this Belgian soldier in his sights to shoot his brains out because he's so appalled with what he's seeing. And he's only stopped from shooting this Belgian soldier's brains out by a colleague. And I've always remembered that story. And I think, and I'm not going to go into detail, but that Belgian soldier was dealt with not so long afterwards. He didn't survive the night. And the fact of the matter is, we hear stories like that. And why is it relevant? Did that actual story happen? I can't prove it, but we have those stories. And I hear those types of things over and over again. And, you know, when we come into the break, if everyone's got a story about the First World War, I'm sure. Keep it short, keep it brief, but I'd like to hear them. It's part of the oral history of this terrible conflict. There are archaeologists excavating at Messines Ridge. I did promise you the Somme, and that's where we're going to go in a short while. But I've got a wonderful article in front of me, and I'm going to read every single word of it, but it's entitled, How Archaeology is Unraveling the Secrets of World War I Trench Warfare. And the reason why this is very relevant is because it's dated Sunday, the 5th of January, 2020. It's my birth date, the 5th of January, and I was also born on a Sunday in 1975. So I thought I'd use this article. But World War I was the planet's first global industrialized conflict. And the use of new technologies like planes, armored tanks, machine guns, grenades, poison gas resulted in unprecedented devastation. Between 1914, between the 28th of July and obviously 1914, and obviously on the 11th hour of the 11th month, 1918, on the Western Front alone, the loss of life of 8 million military personnel and 6 million civilians. That does not include Gallipoli, that doesn't include the Greek campaign, the Russian campaign, does not include Iraq, it does not include any of the other campaigns or fields in Africa. So we're talking in that moment alone, 8 million individuals were dead on those fields of battle on the Western Front. And one thing to remember is that over 180,000 British personnel are still unfound along that front. 180,000 personnel. And it's not, the archaeologists not just looking for the trench, the level of the trench warfare and how the trenches look and if they can find any artifacts. They're still finding some of these individuals. And believe me, when you find somebody who is dead from a conflict, like I have, and I'm not going to go into detail about that and those events, it does something to you. It brings you back to the moment where that individual was killed not so long ago. I actually found somebody on an excavation who died in the Cyprus Turkish conflict. Funnily enough, he was laid to rest in 1975, also the year I was born. And when you find a body like this, you know full well that if you can identify them, that some of the relatives are probably still alive, that soldier's children might still be alive. And it's quite poignant. So we can't find these bodies by looking at first-hand accounts. We've got to do the archaeology. There are lots of original film reels. There are lots of photographs. There are tens of thousands of written accounts. There are post-war assessments. There are aerial views, but we still don't know where all the alignments of the trenches were. In connection with Belgium, for example, there were 3,000 lengths of trenches, communication trenches in Belgium alone, 3,000. And we've no idea where they all were. We have got no idea. And it's only in the archaeology that we can actually understand what's going on in the ground. So what I'm gonna try and do is try and fit in so much today, and I know that I'm not going to be able to do it all, but I think one of the key areas of archaeological excavation was those that were beginning to uncover these stories and to bring it to public media at the beginning of the 2000s. Up until that point, it was not really a public thing, you know, because um, um, Sergeant Sergeant so and so. I actually met a First World War veteran, and he was a fighter pilot, and he was called Hubert. And I met this fighter pilot that had been not involved in on the Western Front, but a fighter pilot in the Balkan campaign. And do you know what? I can remember it now. It was in the winter of 1999. I think it was something like September. This guy was 101. And I wanted to ask him so many questions. And I was told by his carer not to ask him questions, just to let him talk. And I thought, oh, right, okay. So I asked him a question. I said, tell me something about the First World War. And he said he'd flown over the Balkans, and then he stopped and he said, I'm just going to tell you one more thing. He said, the only thing I'm going to tell you about the First World War is that I wish that the First World War could have been the end to all wars. And then he stopped and he went to his next room, and I never saw him again. And that was very poignant. And also I'm going to say something very poignant as well, which some of you are going to be very disagreeable with. If I could go back into a time machine, knowing what I know, I would have fought with the Germans. I would have used my knowledge of the First World War to find a breakthrough into the Belgian front line. I'd have got the Germans to win the First World War. They would not have invaded Britain. The First World War would have been over. There would have been no Second World War. There would have been no Spanish Civil War. There would have been no Holocausts. Europe would have recovered. And all those wonderful achievements that we were seeing in 1914 that had been destroyed by 1918 would have been over. And I know that sounds pie in the sky, but I'm very clear on what I say, that the First World War was a complete nonsense. It was a complete waste of life, a complete wasted sense of sacrifice. And it took away humanity's best opportunity to do something positive with this technology. And all we have today is still the end results of the First World War. The First World War is still causing all the problems that we find on the planet today. In Africa, all the problems that we see in the Middle East. And the First World War was an absolute disaster of humanity. And I feel that. And I'm not going to be swayed from thinking that either. Back to the archaeological excavations that you see in front of us. And then we look at a scratch and sniff. Now, Keith.
Hello.
Can you tell me what that thing is in the left-hand corner? Because it took me 2 lectures for us to work this out. Hang on, go back in. Any ideas what that could be? It's about
a headlight.
Hang on,
looks like a headlight on a motorbike to me.
It's a searchlight. You are right.
Yeah.
It's a large searchlight. You are very right, and that's what it is. Everyone said because that plank there is about, I don't know, 8 inches wide. So this thing's about 2 foot in height. So yeah, it's a searchlight. So you're right.
Yeah.
Nobody actually guessed that, and they found this. This is one of those artifacts they found with the archaeological excavations at Messines Ridge. And you're thinking that they had searchlights? Really? That's not written about in the history, is it? And the other thing as well is, another stark thing about Messines Ridge with the excavations there in 2018. They actually found that the Germans actually had rubber boots. And lots of Germans didn't get trench foot because they actually had rubber boots. I didn't know they had rubber boots, for God's sake. But what we do know is that the colonies of the Germans in America, they had access to rubber
Africa.
plantations. Exactly.
Africa.
Bingo. Africa. Exactly. Africa, Tanzania, and all those places. So we're learning things. I'm learning things that I never knew anything about, and it's only now, not in the writings, that we're actually learning about these things. When I was in school, there was a book in my history room. I did A-level history, and I'm not proud to say that I failed my A-level history because I hated it so much. It was nothing about the Romans or the medieval period. It was all about the Corn Law and all these other things. But eventually, we did something about the First World War. But at that point, I'd lost interest. And I'm saying that as an archaeologist, but I'd really lost interest. However, there was a book on the shelf, and you opened it, and I think it was a book dated 1918, and it had a caption, and the caption was about British soldiers marching into Damascus in 1917, and it said underneath, "They're there because they're there," and I laughed. And then, not so long afterwards, I realised what that meant. They're there because they're there. Because nobody actually knew what the First World War was about. Some say 2 points. There's 2 really important points. A few months before the outbreak of the First World War, the Kaiser was in a yacht in the Solent between the Isle of Wight and Plymouth, welcoming on board the Prince of Britain on board his yacht. He would keep close contact with King George, for example. You can imagine them phoning each other up 2 months before the war saying, "How are you, mate?" You can imagine it, right? 2 months later, they're at war with each other. And you're thinking,
Yeah,
this is absolute madness. This is complete madness. And, and you're thinking, well, how has this happened? One thing that I really remember, not from my A-level class, but from my GCSE, I remembered this. I passed my GCSE, by the way, because I was actually interested. And I was sat down in the history room, and a history teacher, he come up with a chart on the wall, and he said, "This is the start of the First World War. This is why it happened." My history teacher was a little bit racist, those damnable Germans, and he said on the 28th of June, and I'm not reading this out, by the way, in Sarajevo, Serbia, there was the Archduke Ferdinand, the Crown Prince, in his vehicle with the driver and his wife. And I never checked this up to work out the chain of events, but he's being driven through the street, and there's an individual known as Princip. And Princip was a member of an organization called the Black Hand. And the organization Black Hand was a rebellious organization that wanted to see a complete independent Serbia, completely free of outside influences and all these other things. Anyway, he threw a bomb into the Archduke Ferdinand's vehicle. It went off. The Archduke Ferdinand was injured. That was it. He lived. Anyway, went around the corner. There was a building, and Princip somehow got to the building, shot at blank range the Archduke Ferdinand. The Archduke Ferdinand died. A few days later, the Austrians basically said, this is not on. If we don't have reparations, if we can't sort this out, we're going to declare war on Serbia. 28th of July, 1 month later, war was declared on Serbia. Because Serbia was an ally of Russia, Russia declared war on Austria. And then because Germany was an ally of Austria and Hungary, because now Russia was involved, Germany declared war on Russia. Because Germany declared war on Russia, France was an ally of Russia. So France was now at war with Germany. Because Germany was now at war with France, because the next ally in the Entente powers was actually Britain, they were now at war with Germany. And then you've got Italy entering the war. You've got Turkey entering the war, the Japanese, the Chinese. You got the Americans eventually turning up in 1917, taking all the glory, which I'm really angry about always. And you start to think about, this was all caused because one person died. And this caused the deaths of not just 8 million people on the Western Front, but tens of millions of individuals, not just combatants and civilians. And this actually tells you how ridiculous the war was. You know, there was a magazine called Home and Country. And in Home and Country in 1914, it would say, "Come on, lads, come on over to this glorious war. Come and fight. It will be over by Christmas." And it was never over by Christmas. And it was never over by Christmas. And what we do see is that not so long afterwards, the reporters in Home and Country were not writing how wonderful the First World War is, how terrible the First World War is. You look at these three other objects on the screen, and you look at the duck boarding, the duck planking in the bottom of this trench that they're excavating, and you actually look at you see a fog watch. The last person looking at this fog watch was somebody standing in the trench before a bomb dropped in the trench, collapsing the trench, killing the man, and stopping the stopwatch forever. So in other words, the archaeologist touching this watch is touching a watch that was last held by somebody alive in 1917, and a few minutes later he was dead. And that is a flare gun. And flare guns are very important to a poem associated with Wilfred Owen, which we're going to read out. And that flare gun is part of the history. It's part of the archaeology. A flare gun could be seen to be fired for several different reasons. Sort of fired to indicate light for the men to go over the top. The next thing, the whistle. And they go over the top. That's what the flare gun means. The flare gun could also mean gas. Boys, gas, 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 gas. And this is what this flare gun is about. You know, again, all these poignant reminders. And strangely enough, at Messines Ridge, we're not just finding sets of human remains. We're finding some of the cartridge boxes and the artifacts left behind at the moment that the trenches collapsed. You know, I've done research on this, and you're talking about shell shock, you're talking about wind shock, you're talking about all these different terms. So what's really happening when an incendiary is dropped, when a bomb is dropped, when anything goes off with a loud bang, it sucks all the oxygen out of the atmosphere, and it sucks in the sides of the trenches. And what happens is anyone in those trenches is going to be squashed, and anything underneath is going to be, you know, it's said, I've done the research on this, so I can't really work out one way or another. Some people say that when you're being attacked by bombs dropping onto the trenches and onto your lines, you should actually open your mouth. Others say you should actually close your mouth. I think the main thing is you should actually close your mouth, because if you don't close your mouth, then the oxygen is going to be sucked out your lungs, and you're just going to be instantly dead. Somebody who's actually fired armaments, I was always told to keep my mouth open, because if you don't keep your mouth open as you fire, if you don't have your mouth open, your eardrums are going to be shattered. So there's different ways of looking at it. Whatever way, it was a terrible place to be in those trenches. A moving army is always the best army. A moving army that you could associate with the campaigns of the Napoleonic War, a moving army that you could associate with the campaigns of the First World War as the Second World War. And one wonderful thing about the Second World War, and when I say wonderful, the initial chapter of the Second World War, when the Germans invade France and Belgium, between 19 and 21 days, Germany had conquered Belgium and France. with the loss of very few lives. That's great. However, the end result is everything else that happens. But from a campaign level, conquering France in such a short period of time with the loss of minimal lives was brilliant. In the First World War, there was the loss of 8 million lives, if you want to compare that initial campaign where Germany invades France in the Second World War. So the one that wins every time, the minimal loss of life, is the one in the Second World War. Finding the fallen, the evidence of who you were lies buried in the battlefield. Where you fell, all we have to do is find it. And when I say 180,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers still there on the battlefield, still to be found, right? You need to add in probably around 200,000 Germans, Austrians, the same figure of French, not so many Belgians, and you start to come up with a figure of in excess of 5,800,000 souls, bodies still to be recovered at the landscape of the First World War. And you say that this is not relevant, some of you, and I know one or two will say that, you know, let's leave the bodies on the battlefield. But how would you feel one of your relatives still being left on the battlefield and you still haven't mourned that individual? That's what we're talking about. I you know, finding a body myself, and you know what impact that had on the family. So finding the fallen, and let's move on. Personal effects. You can talk about personal effects, and you can connect with personal effects from picking them up in a junk shop, or reading about them, or go into a museum. But when archaeologists actually find a shaving brush and a harmonica, the person who last used these was alive. And you're touching something that was held in that person's hand the second they died. That's what we're talking about. And this is the link. And it's not just the artifacts from Messines or the Somme. These things are being found every day. I'm told by people who've actually been to these battlefields that if you look on the side of the road, there are stockpiles of unexploded armaments from the First World War. And every now and then, the bomb disposal unit of the French or the Belgians go in there and they disarm the bombs, and occasionally people lose their lives on these old battlefields. I'm a bit distracted at this minute because I'm just having people join us a minute. Hang on. Right, okay. So one thing I'm going to say is that linking in directly with this, and you're not going to hear this in the records, Keith, but the excavations at Messines Ridge 2 years ago, they were excavating the remains of a German soldier's backpack, and as they excavated it, they found the remains of a teddy bear and a little and one of those little Steiff factory buttons that they sew behind the ear of toys back then. A Steiff, it was a Steiff toy. They found this little bear, and you're thinking, does this indicate that the soldier was actually a child? Does this indicate that this person may have been 13 or 14 and he still had his teddy bear with him? Or was this teddy bear representative of a father who had brought one of his children's toys with him? And then
good luck, yeah, good luck symbol.
Exactly. Or he's keeping hold of this toy as a gift for his son or his daughter. And you don't read about that in the history books. You don't sense that in the history books. And you've got, and when you're seeing this archaeology, It brings on a different mantle. I thought that there's something very, very unusual when I was reading, doing the research for this. And sometimes when you're doing research, you think, oh no, I've forgotten something. And one thing I'd forgotten on Monday morning when I first researched this was a question I've always had. And the question has to be, Keith, did those digging the trenches find anything in regards to archaeology? And the answer is yes. I've got two images. One is a woodcut, and there's this photograph of a British soldier carrying a prehistoric ceramic pot on the Salonika front in northern Greece from the First World War. And this image links me into my First World War friend, Hubert. This is the type of uniform he would have worn before they started having flying officers' uniforms. This is the type of thing he would have worn. But archaeological evidence, they were digging up archaeological artifacts. And I know, Keith, you're not a fan of bone kickers, but but the one episode about bone kickers finding the Maid of Orleans, what were they looking for? A coffin in it, and I'm not going to go into that. But my friend, Professor, oh God, Mark Horton, Professor Mark Horton, actually researched lots of things for that series. And some of what you saw in that film, the Mark I that they excavated in bone kickers and all the rest of it, and all the superstitions and so on and so on. They were archaeologists in that series, right? That they were excavating. And that was probably based on some reality, because some of those digging these trenches were in fact archaeologists. And you can imagine, wow, look what I found. And then they're thinking, right, hang on a minute. I know I might be an academic archaeologist, and I know it's 1914. I may be an academic archaeologist, but because I've gone to Oxford, I am now an officer. Do I put the archaeology first or the lives of my men? And my answer is I would have put the lives of my men first.
Yeah, you hope so.
I that's what I would have done. But I'm sure that those archaeologists that did return, but mind you, most of those officers that were archaeologists in 1914 wouldn't have returned home either. So they wouldn't have been able to say much of, so we got this nice little photograph. And the one thing I've got from my own granddad from the Second World War actually is a photograph of his travels when he was an aircraft fitter in Tunisia. So I know it's a different war. So the Somme. And then we're going to go on to something very poignant. We're going to go on to this. We're going to go on to, this is written by Wilfred Owen around 1917. And he died at the Somme on the 4th of November, 1918. Just days, 1 week before the ceasefire. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. How sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country. And that flare gun comes into its own now. Bent double like old beggars under sacks. Not need. Coffin like hags. We cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on. Bloodshod. All went lame, all blind. Drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots, or gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green lights, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, bitter as the cud, of vile incurable sores and on innocent tongues, my friend, you could not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, how sweet and fitting it is to die for one's country. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori. And we don't really see or think about the glories about the First World War as we used to. One thing about the gas is to be said in that poem, but I don't see it as a poem. I see it as a real account of the terrible nature of the First World War. The gas itself would almost take your lungs apart, and as you're choking and coughing, you would be coughing up your lungs. And another point I'm going to make is that some of you may not wish me to say this, but I'm going to say this. There was one saving grace with Adolf Hitler. In 1944, when his science officers came to visit him, they said that we have developed a gas that could win the war for you. And the first thing that the Fuhrer said was, we're not going to use gas. And some of his scientists were begging him, look, we can use the gas on the Eastern Front. It'll win us the war. He said, we are not going to use gas. And then he explained why he's not going to use gas. Simply because gas itself was used against him in the First World War. He was in hospital because of it. And obviously the effect that it had on him meant that he vowed never to see the use of gas again. And that saved the lives of possibly millions of soldiers and civilians on the Western and Eastern Front. And that's thanks to Adolf Hitler's decision. And I'm sorry if some of you don't like that, but that's a fact. This is the Battle of the Somme. And we've got one piece of archaeology to talk about the Battle of the Somme, and then we're going to take a break. And I'm not sure we're going to get through all this today either. The Battle of the Somme, 1916. So here we go. Let's get my little arrows on. Let's be Dan Snow and let's move things forward. On the 1st of July, this was the big push. And if anyone have ever seen that last scene of Blackadder, Blackadder goes forth, you will know the scene I mean. The great push. Let's go over the front, lads. The 1st of July 1916, and the final line of the 19th of November 1916. 140 days. And if you want to see over 140 days, the gain was less than 10 miles. At the loss of life of up to 1 million soldiers. 1 million lives were lost over a distance of 10 miles. And this was regained again by the Germans and captured by the Allies. The great push of the Germans in 1918. And you start to realize again the pointlessness of this conflict. And you can talk as much as you like in the history, but it's only in the archaeology that you can actually learn the truth. You know, we don't see these lines anymore. There are one or two places along the Somme that you can actually see some of the trenches reconstructed. You can climb and wander around the trenches and see how wonderful this thing was. Just poke your head over the top. It was nothing like that at all. It was the duck boarding, dead bodies around you, rats running around, getting trench foot. 75,000 British soldiers died from trench foot alone. And the gains, just think, over 2 weeks, in 2 weeks, France had nearly been conquered in the Second World War. In 2 weeks, they had gained 2 miles of land. 2 miles, that's all. And another 3 or 4 miles by the 15th of September. And then eventually, the generals stopped believing that they could win the war, and they stopped. And that was it. And I tell you what, if I had seen my entire company wiped out because of this, the only thing I would want is revenge. Not against the Germans that I was fighting, but against the officers that sent us into war. And it's been agreed and disagreed that the statement, lambs go into slaughter, lions led by lambs.
Donkeys.
Donkeys, yeah. And the reason why I get the saying mixed up there is because the original saying is actually from Plutarch, and it's changed lots of times. So lions led by donkeys, and the quote's changed, as I say. But you're right, Keith. Lions led by donkeys. Some people say that was never said. I will say that it was said, because Plutarch over 1,900 years earlier stated that. So this would have been stated associated with the First World War. So let's move on. So we know where the Somme is, and some of you don't. So we've got a little chart coming up. This is for the wonderful Ellen, who may have left us, or she's still there. There it is. There's the Somme, and then the other one we're going to do is Messines Ridge a year later. And this front line basically didn't move much over the course of 4 years. It just didn't move. And one of the things that my wonderful children said yesterday, and Rosamund's going to be proud of her grandson, Stav, when I mentioned this. Stav and Evan said to me, they said about 1914, when 1914, the 25th of December, and the German lines started to sing Christmas songs. And you can imagine the Welsh soldiers on the line are not going to have any of this, not going to be outsung by the Bosch. So they start singing. And it would have been the Welsh regiment that Sergeant Williams, my relative, would have been in. And he would have witnessed this. I'm sure he would have. And then the singing stopped. And then a German soldier shouted out, "Tommy, have you got any fags?" And one of the Tommy said, "Yes, I do." "Well, come on then, let's have them." So the German gets out of his trench, and the Tommy gets out of his trench, meets in no man's land, and then all the other soldiers come out, and the officers are thinking, just let them do it, right? And one of them brings out a football, and they're playing football, and we hear these stories up and down the Western Front. It's absolutely amazing. And some say this happens at the next day as well. And 3 days later, they're blowing each other's brains out. And you're thinking, this is absolute mad. This is absolute pointless. The whole thing is absolute mad. And I'm reminded of that by 2 children. And I'm just thinking, if that's the only thing that you remember about the First World War, then you realize how pointless this was. Absolutely pointless. And not to make you even more depressed, guys, the 1st of July 1916, the 18th of July 1919, the British and the French, led by those idiots fighting the Germans, equally so. The Allies, the Entente powers, over that period of time, 3 million at strength, men and women. And then you look at the German strength, 1.5 million. So there's 2 to 1. And strangely enough, you don't usually see this, but the casualties on the German side were nearly 700,000. And the casualties on the Allied side, the attacking force, were just over 620,000 casualties. And a large percentage of them are dead. So 1 million dead at the Somme. And a big chunk of those bodies have never been found. 280 burial grounds across France alone. And if we, as we go towards our break, and we will discuss Neil Faulkner's work from 2003. Yes, if you ever see Neil Faulkner and mention my name, say hello. I used to communicate with him some time ago. And this could be anywhere on the Western Front. This could be even Gallipoli, but this is on the Western Front. And the one thing that you can pick out from this photograph is actually a body in the side of the trench. There's his skull, and there's his trench coat. And this has just been taken blasé. They used to give them names. King Street. This is the firing line. And you're just thinking, they're just getting ready to go over the top. And within moments, half of these are going to be dead. And the ones that do survive might get to the German line, or they might be writhing in agony with a leg gone, with half their head shot off. And this, you think that within a day, they're dead. Half of these men are going to be dead. And again, we are finding their remains on the battlefield today. And one interesting point as well is that the combat soldiers in the First World War carried half their body weight in gear. So that would be hand grenades. That would be with some of them several hundred rounds. I think you would have carried between about 30 or 60 rounds of ammunition usually, but if you're a bit sort of garish, you'd carry more. And when they excavate the bodies of these individuals, by the way, you only see you don't see many sets of human remains today. I've kept that deliberate because I'm very not happy with seeing bodies from the First World War. So if you look at the Somme today, 1 or 2 humps and bumps, but an interesting fact is this. When the armistice was signed, the night of the 11th of November, basically, on the 11th hour of the 11th month, there's going to be a ceasefire. Within a couple of days, the civilians were just being told, right, there it is. We don't need it anymore. It's yours again. You can imagine a French farmer saying, what? Oh, by the way, that tank over there, you can use that. And the French farmer saying, hang on a minute, how am I going to grow crops in this? Well, there's your answer. Go and get that French tank, right? And use it to fill in the trenches. And this is what happened. Most of the trenches were filled in by the civilian farmers. Whilst the tractor's going over the ground, there's an explosion and the farmer's killed. So this is actually still what's happening today. The civilians were left dealing with the outcome of the First World War battlefields. And as I say, we look at 2 sets of human remains today, and this is one of them, and obviously the one in the trench there as well. So make that a third. Now, Neil Faulkner was a chap that used to be in Time Team. He was the lippy bloke that never used to agree with anything. A tall, lanky bloke, looks a little bit like me with fuzzy hair, with a bit of an attitude. And when he That's how we got on. So when we used to email back and forth, I didn't know that in about 2003, he was excavating in France. Hence the link with Wilfred Owen, because he was excavating at the Somme where Wilfred Owen died on the 4th of November, 1918. And he...
Oh, your sound is going in and out.
Right, okay. Those that are hearing my sound going out will be happy to hear that this is being recorded. So if you do miss anything, you will get this as a recording. How bad has the sound been recently?
Yeah, it's just the last few minutes or so when you've been fading in and out.
Okay, don't worry about it. If anyone misses this bit, we can do a little bit of a recap in the break. But back to this, Neil Faulkner, friend of mine, he was excavated in 2003. And lo and behold, he finds 3 bodies. And some of you are thinking, wow, he finds 3 bodies. But no, these are 3 bodies of 3 individuals. They identified 2 as German, 1 as probably British. And this was at the Somme. And the typical identification, knowing that these are German, and 1916 as well, because everyone's carrying gas masks by this, and they're carrying this typical circular cylindrical box that isn't a foot long, and basically there would be a little catch on that. So as the German soldier, is being with the flare gun, or the toot goes up and somebody shouts gas, the first thing they do is he reaches to the back. There's a little clip on it, clicks the clip, brings out the gas mask, chucks off his helmet, puts the gas mask on. Brilliant. The British ones were a lot more cumbersome, and the Germans were much better prepared for gas. The Germans were much better prepared for gas than the Allies were. And they had all the paraphernalia ready, and obviously identification, this is a German for a start. But the other identification is that because of hang on a minute, there's a tiny bit of text which has been missed. Hang on a minute, let's just I think the text is a little bit further on. Oh, there it is. So they've actually found out that one guy lying in the ground was identified as Jacob Honnes, a farm labourer from Munchingham near Stuttgart, who served in the German 121st Reserve Infantry Regiment, who died in July 1915. And this body was found in 2003. And it's possible, I'm not saying it's possible, that they may have actually tracked down his direct children and said, actually, we found your dad, or we found your granddad. And you can imagine the effect that would have on anybody. And I can't put it to words. So what we've got this is a reconstructed version, but this is quite simple. The idea was that it's hang on the belt behind you, and you just as you reach behind, flick that, and you just rip your gas mask out, put it over your head. You basically got about 30 seconds to do it from the moment the bombs dropped. And there you go. Rather interesting. This is what a German soldier looked like by 1916. If anyone's ever seen the film Biggles, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. What are we looking at? We're in the archaeology. We have got evidence later on in this lecture: stick grenade, dagger, some bayonets. Some bayonets you would actually place into the barrel. You'd actually place it directly into the barrel, or you would fix it to the trunk of the firearms itself. As the war goes on, people actually realise that you need to fire whilst you've got a bayonet in, and you can't fire if the bayonet's actually been placed down the barrel. So multi-use weapon, but this actually come in later in the war, amazingly enough. That's obviously got the gas mask in it. This man may have been an officer because he's got binoculars, and you've got the trench coat, and that there is vital. It's only later on in the war that you actually get dog tags, and the whole people actually started to realise, and the soldiers realised this as well. If you weren't issued with a dog tag, you would make your own. because you're thinking, well, you know, 10 of my mates have gone, sorry, 10 of my mates went over the top today, 2 returned, 3 were blown to bits, and I don't know if we're going to recover the other 5, right? So they started to realize that if you create your own dog tag, hopefully your body can be recovered, and your body sent home to your parents or buried somewhere in France. At least you're going to be identified. It's amazing that you get all these little things. War came of age in the First World War. This was not the first conflict that trench warfare is actually seen. The first conflict that trench warfare is actually seen on an industrial scale is the American Civil War. The American Civil War is the first time aerial photography is used. In the American Civil War, air reconnaissance is used. But the difference in the Second World War, you're able to fly a plane, and the plane's able to go over the enemy's trench, and you're able to take photographs more consistently than the American Civil War. And a few other interesting points, not only trench warfare, you've actually got barbed wire used in the American Civil War from December 1860 all the way through to 1865, and barbed wire is actually used. Strangely enough, without the barbs. Anyway, moving on. Therefore, it's not barbed wire. I think they were metal lines, and they actually put weird sort of things on them. But the industrial barbed wire of the Second World War actually had the barbs specifically mounted into them. And the one thing is, it's not the barbed wire that's killing you. It's your backpack. So you're thinking, I've done this many times, gone under barbed wire, and my coat catches on the barbed wire as I go underneath, or my rucksack catches. So it's the rucksack that's killing people. As they're going under the barbed wire, their rucksack's captured under the barbed wire. They can't release themselves. They're moving around. The enemy can see you. You're dead. And the enemy can just see your head as well. So you're going to die anyway. So let's go on a little bit. And when we actually go on to the questions and a statement from everybody, I want everyone to just leave it to one sentence each. Otherwise, we're not going to get through this lecture today. So whatever you want to say, practice now. So this is dated the 7th of July, 1916. This is by a Welsh artist, and his work is on display in Maesteg. He's a Maesteg artist. And up until 1915, nobody was painting anything like this. What it would do, they would paint how wonderful the war is. In 1914, come on, boys, it's a wonderful war. However, by 1916, this artist, Christopher Williams, like many of the artists, and I was going to use some atrocious language there, they realized that what the government was saying was a load of crap. This was not a good place to go to. There was no glory in war. And the artists were now painting what the war was like. Up until this point, this is on display in the National Museum of Wales, by the way. Up until this point, nobody was showing Allies wounded or dead. Now they are showing them as being dead. It's fine to show a German as dead. Let's kill the old Bosch, the old Hun. Let's get rid of them. But artists up until sort of 1916 weren't showing our own men dead, but now they are. And it's the rank and file soldier knowing that this is not glorified war. This is just the killing fields. Now, again, I want to, before we go on our break, obviously this is, you don't usually see this. This is a captured German trench. I think this may actually be the Somme, I'm not sure. But this is a captured German trench. And one quick thing, if this was a British trench, those sleepers above would have actually come stockpiled from maybe Wales, because at that time, lots of the pit props were being sent over to, break a minute, the pit props were being sent over to be used in the trenches. And obviously pit props were being taken from German mines to be used in the trenches. So this is what you're seeing here. They're all having a break, these lads. And basically that individual there, eventually his shift will end. And then one of the other guys would take over. These guys are breaking in the day because they've been fighting all night. So, and you know, when you think about going over the top, they built steps to go over the top. They didn't actually go over the side of the trench because you can't really clamber over the side of the trench because it's vertical. There'd be steps to go over the side of the trench. And what would be in the sights of those steps would be a machine gun made at the Spandau factory outside Berlin. Quite ironic, after 1919, the Spandau factory was making toys and so on because they couldn't make armaments anymore, linking in with that earlier story. And I've got to say it, those that were fans of the group Spandau Ballet in the 1980s will know that the name Spandau Ballet for the group comes in tribute to the soldiers that danced in front of the machine guns that were manufactured at at the Spandau factory, hence the term Spandau Ballet. The British soldiers referred to those going over the top as in Spandau Ballet. That's an interesting quiz answer to a question. And last now, we're breaking. This is what I talked about, 1914, as they're digging their lines for the trenches. It's quite interesting, actually. And what's interesting is another fact that I'm not really aware of, and I've only just realized it. They're digging trenches while the Allies are digging trenches. And you're thinking, hang on a minute, why doesn't the one side take advantage of the other side and just push forward? And you're thinking, well, actually, they must have decided at some point that our side is going to dig a trench and your side's going to dig a trench. Because you can't dig a trench like this if you're constantly under fire. It's almost as if they right, Fritz, we're going to dig our trench and you dig yours. Lovely. And at this point, there's this German officer overseeing the excavation of a Roman monument in this trench. What happened to this Roman monument is nobody's business, but it's likely, I think, that this Roman monument would have been taken out. Because if there was a direct hit on this Roman monument, so shrapnel would have gone everywhere. So it would have been, so you'd have needed to take this out, and you'd have needed to have had the side of the trench embedded with soil rather than stone monuments like this. So this would have needed to have been taken out and not reburied. And again, this answers my question about the archaeology that was excavated in the First World War. And what I'd like to do now, Keith, it's been wonderful having this journey with you today. Is there anything you would like to say or add to this lecture now?
I can add a bit of oral history there.
Please do.
My mother was very young in the First World War, and she was taken out in 1916 into her back garden to see a burning fireball coming down from the sky. And it was one of the first Zeppelins that had been shot down. She was taken out by her father to see that in her back garden.
The Zeppelin, it's that 1916 Zeppelin attack, yeah?
Yeah.
Do you know what? A story like that is golden. It really is. Where were you when this happened?
I wasn't quite born yet.
Oh, no, I'm sorry.
This was in London.
Oh, London, okay.
In East London.
Right, no, that's what I meant. I knew you weren't born back then. Let me know.
Dennis was, I know.
Hang on, that goes without saying. You didn't even need to say that. Right, everybody, stop screen sharing now. Let's. I would like a comment from absolutely everybody. Just one sentence. So I just would like to. I've unmuted everybody. So unmute on 3, 2, 1. Goff, what would you like to say? Okay.
Can't hear you, Goff.
Oh.
Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to move from Goff a minute, let him sort that out. Sue, what would you like to...
Oh, he's back.
Very powerful.
Very
powerful.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you. Goff?
Yeah, I was wondering what sort of area, miles, how big was the conflict area that we're talking about?
You're talking. You're talking about 420 miles. That I think that's the Belgian front line, and you're talking. I think it was a 1,000 miles from north to south.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, Belgium's coast down to Switzerland's the whole front line.
Exactly. So you're talking about a considerable front line, and I can't not be emotive in this lecture. I can't because it's in me, because I've lived with it. Karen.
I was just wondering if the fact that they found these artifacts, but then may have kept them somewhere else, might that have skewed our view of history now?
Actually, that is an absolutely brilliant statement. The answer must be yes. And secondly, oh my God, that's a PhD. Well done. Yeah, yes. No, that is an amazing statement. Thank you for that. I'm lost for words. That is so true. Yes, thank you, Pam.
My dad was in the war, but I'm not sure whether it was the First or the Second World War. But he signed up and lied about his age. A lot of people did, to actually fight for their country.
First World War.
He was First World War. Was that?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was doing his, he was a chemist anyway, and doing his apprenticeship in Manchester.
Yes.
And anyway, he went to war, and this is as my dad told me. A man named Alf took him under his wing because he was so young, and they were both in the trenches, and
First World War.
Dad was beside him, and Alf got shot. He was killed. And you know, just a story like
that's important.
I mean, I switch off the war, and like lots of regrets, like a lot of people, but that story stays with you.
And you know what? Can I just jump in there? In my parents' attic, there's a sword, and there's a bayonet, and the bayonet I think may have been taken off this Belgian bloke. My grandmother said that it was better to have 10 Germans behind you than a Belgian. You couldn't trust them. I know that's racist, but that's a story from the time. And there's this sword that I'm actually told was actually that German officer's sword. He brought it back to remind him of that event that day. Ellen, anything? One sentence, Ellen.
There was some very touching moments in just a massive wholesale slaughter. So yes. it is all very emotional and not nice.
Exactly. Jim?
I saw a programme about the tunnel, the diggers. And there was the tunnel under each other's trenches, and sometimes they'll meet, the two sides of meet while they're tunnelling, which must be horrific.
So yeah, the tunnelling with Messines Ridge really does come into it, and that's a really good point. Very, very good point. And Rosamund?
I was just, the memories can be kept alive by the children. I hadn't realised what I'd said to staff about the memories I've got from my grandfather and my great uncle. So it's great that the children hear the stories without us even knowing, and that keeps the memory alive, which I'm really pleased, because it's such an emotive time. And
and anyone that has missed bits of this lecture can catch up on it with YouTube. And obviously I've got my little YouTube discussion tomorrow. If anyone's interested, it's free tomorrow anyway. It's just an extension of what we're doing today. Right, Chris, anything?
Yeah, just a bit of oral history. My paternal grandfather was gassed in the First World War. Christ. He survived because he went on to have my mum in 1925. And on my maternal grandmother's side, her youngest brother is buried in Alexandria because he fought out there. He was about 18 or 19, I think.
Oh, blimey now, that. I'll tell you what, the campaign in the Middle East was far worse, but that's another lecture. And Jane, before we have our break, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I came in late, but what I heard was very powerful. but what what I'm just struggling to reconcile in my head is how Hitler obviously didn't want to use the gas because of his own experiences.
I know what you're
How
going
did
to
he
say.
How did he get from that to the gas chambers?
Absolutely.
No, hang on a minute. This was the controversy. I think the point being made is that the gas chambers would have happened anyway, right? So the point is whether gas was used on the front line or not, the gas chambers would have happened anyway. The point I am trying to make is not I'm trying to make is it wasn't used in frontline combat. So that's how the lives were saved, and that's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not saying it to disrespect those 12.
No, I didn't think so.
12 million, but that is the point. This is why it was a controversial statement to make. To be honest with you, if gas had landed on Coventry or landed in London, you know, we would be talking about half a million dead in civilian casualties in Britain from the Second World War. It would have been absolutely horrific, and it's thanks to that decision that gas was not used.
It was probably a sign of his schizophrenic type of personality, wasn't it? That, you know, he thought one thing about it in one circumstance and another completely different. Yeah.
Very good point. On that note, we're going to have a 10-minute break, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Could I ask a technical question of people, please?
Please do.
I used to be able to tap a little plus sign in the corner of my photograph, and then I could see everybody's photographs. And now I can't. Has anybody? I can see my photograph, and I can see one other person, but I can't see anybody else.
Is everybody seeing everybody else?
Yeah, all up at the top. Have you got
Yeah.
a little arrow button?
It
Well,
depends
I'd
what
like
you are you using an iPad, Jane?
well, at the moment I'm using my iPhone, but
that's it.
Oh, yeah, right.
yesterday I used my iPad and it was the same on there.
All right.
If you've got a laptop, it's going to be different, as Goff said.
Yeah, well, my iPad, there's two little dots on the left-hand side at the top. You can share your pictures. So whether you tap the very top of the screen, you get a bar with all the information on mute, video.
It, yeah.
But on the left-hand side, there's two white dots. You can press for camera, I think, or something else.
No, I haven't got that. I've got the camera and the mute thing and all sorts of other stuff.
It's on the other side of the screen.
Anyway, I'm off for a drink.
Okay.
Right, okay.
So now what we're going to do, we're going to cut, we're going to mute everybody. Is that your dog, Jane?
No.
No, it's one of ours.
You know what, right? I know, Jane, I know that Pam has a really husky, sexy voice, right? But her dogs do my head in. Jane, I've just unmuted you, so are you going to join me?
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, Jane, it's nice and clear, Jane.
Yeah, I've changed to my iPad.
Okay. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to play this the same with Keith. Then no need to say anything, but if I asked you something, then reply. So this is a good start, and the comments that were made, after the break were very fitting. And sometimes when you're doing a second half of a lecture, you've got to try and get into the flow. But this helps me get into the flow because, again, we've already mentioned this image. Being an archaeologist working frontline action, that is, again, I'll repeat, answering the question that I've always had. Did people find anything when they were digging out their trenches? And do you know what the fitting point I actually made earlier on was, if these guys are constantly being shot at, why are these three in the forefront without uniforms and without helmets, nicely digging away the trenches, indicating to me that they must have just stopped in the First World War, both sides, and they said, look, guys, let's dig these trenches. Because I can't for the life of me think how they would have dug these trenches if they were constantly under fire. And that's something that isn't in the history books, or if it is, I haven't read it. This is a devastating landscape. And again, after the war, after the armistice, nobody's really taken a note of where these trenches are. And by the time anyone's interested 10 or 20 years later, most of the trenches have been filled in, and lots of the artifacts as well. And whilst they're digging out these trenches, in lots of places, they're coming across lots of sets of human remains and various monuments. Now, these are actually 3 rounds from a German type rifle known as a Mauser, and a rifle themselves, there would have been 3 bullets on a little bit of a pool below. So a rifleman's able to fire 5 rounds at a time, which is coming into an innovation of the time. Both sides had rifles that could fire more than 2 or 3 rounds at a time without being reloaded. But like the Somme, and like some of the information we've already mentioned, at Messines Ridge, the site of those great craters, they've got lots of evidence that was lost in a time capsule at the moment that there was the vast explosions at Messines Ridge. I think Keith may have mentioned that at Messines Ridge in 1917, the Entente Allied powers had built up £1 million of TNT, cordite, various other explosives under the German trenches. And they had built this up over the course of about a year. They usually use Kent or Welsh miners to actually dig under the lines of the Germans. And they exploded 19 caches, but 5 didn't explode. And even today, under the ridge at Messines, there are hundreds of pounds of unexploded armaments still ready to go up, and they haven't been retrieved. And it's a bit worrying, really, that maybe one day, if one of those goes off, we'd be able to hear it again in London. And again, when the Messines Ridge explosion occurred, in 1917, that explosion could be heard in London. So I would like now to go to the nice set of notes that I mentioned way at the beginning. It's such a long time ago. And a few poignant comments from this. All the people who actually witnessed the First World War have all passed away. The landscape today remains the last witness. The archaeology is the last witness. It was once a moonscape, and all those traces of the war that were left behind have been backfilled, and lots of them are buried underfoot, only to be excavated when there are new developments across Belgium and France. The excavation site at Messines Ridge in Belgium is known as Dig Hill 80, excavated in 2018, and it's still being worked on today, which is really appropriate. So fresh information. One thing that we can say is not to immortalize the First World War, but memorialize it, to discover the archaeology to help us understand more. It's almost as if it's seeing through the vegetation of the maps and those various accounts. And in lots of ways, they're now, as we've just described from wonderful Keith's article of the week, about using technology to understand Roman sites in, for example, Libya without excavating them. One day we might be able to get a complete plan of all the thousands of miles of trenches from both sides, communication trenches that once existed across the field of battle, the front line. In using historical and modern aerial images, you suddenly get a different perspective alongside the archaeology. The patterns come together. This is no longer a jigsaw of one or two pieces. This is a jigsaw that's been brought together by more pieces excavated. The photographs can tell you something about the trenches, but they cannot tell you everything. The archaeology really does give it to you, does give you a better snapshot than a photograph. Because whenever you see a British soldier in the trench, they've got a smile on their face or they're posing. That's not always true, because that would go against everything that I've already said. But, you know, they are posing. It's in the moment. It's not actually the reality in many cases. And you can read as many, when you think about the trenches and everything I've said about the trenches today, you can read as many First World War manuals of how to dig a trench, as many manuals as you like. You can look at as many maps. But always, if you look into the archaeology, you will see the reality of trench warfare on the ground. And amazingly enough, when we look at Messines Ridge, the region's waterlogged soil helps preserve organic materials, like wood and textiles, a boon for today's archaeologists. But more than 100 years ago, soldiers were in constant battle against the water and mud. Many trenches were mistakenly dug below the water table. As the seasons changed and rain fell, life could become miserable for soldiers. Even when they weren't under fire, trench foot caused by cold, wet, dirty conditions caused the death of 75,000 British soldiers alone. And just to give you an idea of the terrible conditions, the stinky conditions, as one archaeologist tells us, a British soldier who spent time in the network of tunnels down near Ypres wrote that after a descent down more than 30 slippery steps, one would reach the bottom of the shelter and stand in a black and slimy river, slowly moving onward, disappearing into the darkness. It would only be revealed by very weary and old-looking lights. These excavations that we're going to look at, these trenches, help us really understand what we've been talking about. They found discarded bullets that have been hammered out into crucifixes in the moment that they were being hammered out, and suddenly a bomb drops and it's not completed. You find a lot of artifacts that tell the personal stories of soldiers, like the story about the backpack with a teddy bear, that would otherwise never be brought to light, that bring humanity to the soldiers. So it's so great. I was excited when I was actually reading this, because the images are fantastic. So let's go on to these wonderful images. Up until the finding of sites such as the one at Messines Ridge, where the archaeology is so well preserved that you're almost looking at this panoramic view of what the trenches looked like. You know, I love panoramic views of what the trenches and what battlefields look like. But occasionally, the panoramic is not a panoramic, but the actual archaeology that you're looking at. Now, we looked at the Somme earlier on, and now we're looking at Messines Ridge between the 7th and 14th of June. And the area captured was very slight. Now, these are not the casualty figures that we see with the Somme. This is 1917. Things have changed. And what we've got the United Kingdom with Australian, Canadian, New Zealander troops. We'll also chuck a few from India, and we'll chuck a few from South Africa in there as well. And they decide to attack Messines Ridge. Now, you know, there's more divisions, Allied divisions and German divisions. But if you look at the casualty figures, it's very rare, like in the case of the Somme, it's very rare that you get less casualties attacking than the enemy. About 25,000 dead. These not just casualties, dead. 25,000 died in 7 days at Messines Ridge on the Entente Allied side. On the German side, there were 35,000 dead. 10,000 dead more than the attacking side. And why? Because thousands of them were blown to pieces. And the evidence of that is the craters that we're going to see, and the one crater that we've already seen. Messines battlefield archaeology. The ground around Messines showed traces of Roman and medieval settlements. Whilst the archaeologists were believed to be only working on World War I archaeology, during the war, Messines found itself at the center of the German front line, making the area a scene of combat so intense it resulted in near eradication of the village. The presence of the front line and the tactical importance of the German-held high ground, known as Messines Ridge, had resulted in construction of countless underground positions, elaborate trench systems, and the use of tunnels and mines. The mine explosions at Messines Ridge still are the biggest non-nuclear explosions ever heard. And looking at this plan, I'm gonna say this in 2 points of view. Miners mined underneath the German trenches for a whole year. So that's the German front line. And over the course of 1 week, they managed to capture 6 miles for 1 year's worth of undermining the German trenches to put these explosive devices, the TNT cordite in, and the front line that's being excavated, undermined at these points, is where the Allies are going to push through. These are where the mines have been placed underground from the mining activity all the way along here. Remember, 19 exploded. And then what we then find is that 5 remained unexploded. Now, the point is, it's said that when the mines exploded, you could see German soldiers shooting up into the air. You could actually see people being blown apart. And it's said that as the Allies advanced, the German soldiers were standing with their guns poised at them, and they didn't even move. So the Allies just jumped into the trenches and just continued. The Germans, and this isn't a pun, were so shell-shocked, they didn't even fire their weapons after the explosion when the Allies went towards them. In fact, the Allied soldiers didn't even have to open up. They just walk through. But the tragedy is, the biggest tragedy is that they only captured 6 miles for 1 year's worth of effort. So, you know, you're thinking, how pointless is this? And it's a complete pointless waste of life. These German soldiers needn't have died that day because the Allies didn't really gain much. Again, moving on. So this is what the craters look like today. And if we want to sort of be a bit dramatic, if you can think of the Allied trench front line being here, and then you look at the German front line, you can actually see bits of it still. This is a German front line, and there is a bit of the front line there, and then running all the way down here. But interestingly enough, if we take away those lines again, note where they are. There's very little archaeological evidence on the ground. And the only archaeological evidence of the Messines Ridge is really these craters today that have never, ever been backfilled because they're so huge. They're huge craters. The bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I'm going to get this wrong, I know I am. I don't think the bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki left any craters like this. These craters were left because they were mined underground and they were exploded from below. This is why they're so vast. Moving on again, lots to get through still. 20 minutes to go. Oh my God. So here we go. The aerial photography. This is what Messines Ridge looked like before the explosions. And this is along Messines Ridge where the archaeological excavations are taking place. And interestingly enough, when you think about it, it's quite a small area considering. And they found over 200 bodies here, and they're still trying to identify who they are. But when the article was published in January, I think out of the 200 bodies that they've recovered, they've only actually identified three of them and who they are. But then again, with modern technology and DNA, I'm sure they'll get much better results than that. And they're not just individuals from 1916, they're individuals from 1914. So here we go. If we, as we head down these steps, this is actually in a trench that was hit directly from artillery fire, not from the explosions underneath. And what's basically happening is, as there's an explosion, as I described, there's a vacuum and the whole side of the trench collapses. And this is why we're getting so well preserved archaeology. And this is what I was talking about earlier on. I mentioned earlier on that these German rounds have got the date 1914 on them. Again, indicating that these rounds must have been fired in around 1914 and not 1917. Again, indicating a much earlier battle than the one that the archaeologists went there to excavate. Hill 80, if you want to look at more information about this on the internet. There's actually a whole archaeological paper discussing the earlier battle, if any of you actually want to look at that. So again, this isn't Messines Ridge, actually. This is further on down in France. But if you look at this plan, you can actually see you can see the difference in building of the trenches. So obviously Allied trenches, German trenches, and usually what you've got is communication trenches. These here are the pockmarks of the artillery barrages, and we're talking about millions of shells being dropped every single year. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, this has to be an image from much later on in the war. And the reason why I'm saying that, Jane, is if you look down at this, you have a little subject that I'm just going to mention briefly. Look at those things there. They're almost definitely tanks. Now we know about the first tank battle at Cambrai. The Allies had many more tanks than Germans. The Allies had the first tanks. And the little bit of a backstory about that is that the Lord of the Admiralty, a very unknown person in history known as Winston Churchill, insisted that tanks be brought into fight in the First World War. Winston Churchill believed that tanks would be the thing that would win the war. And when tanks were introduced, it said that they killed more people that operated the tanks than the enemy. It put fear into the enemy, but they were not a war winner. And I do believe what we're looking at in this image is actually tanks. And those, to me, actually, if I'm not an expert on this, they don't actually look like British tanks. They actually look like the very large, much more cumbersome German tanks. But again, that's another lecture. Look that one up as a little bit of research, somebody. And the other point, the reason why, Jane, do you know the reason why they call tanks tanks?
No.
Well,
no, only because they're...
No,
Sorry,
don't guess. You'll make a fool of yourself. Basically, the reason why they're called tanks is that when they're being sent over to France in boxes, they to disguise them from any German spies, they put on the boxes, these are water tanks, because they were big bits of metal and, you know, they looked like water tanks, right? And tanks didn't look like tanks then. They were trapezoidal shaped things with two turrets on the side, a turret on the top, and they didn't have a long cannon barrel. And when they went over to France, people said, "Why have we got tanks?" And somebody said, "Actually, you know, when you open them, they're actually the new weapon of Winston Churchill. That's why they're called tanks, named after the label on the box. That's the only reason." Again, this image again, and just quickly mention, I'm very aware, I'm going to go up to 5 to 1, folks, unfortunately. So anyone needs to go. Thanks for joining us today, but I want to go until 1 anyway. So here we go. This is along the French line. There's Messines. I'm going to speed up a little bit more. So, and again, photographs don't always tell the truth, but this you get an idea that this is how you're going to get trench foot in a trench, because it's just full of water, completely flooded. Now this is the sexy bit. These are actually cartridge boxes. And the amazing thing about these cartridge boxes is that they were left at Messines Ridge when the artillery barrage opened up in 1917. And you can actually still see cartridges there. And these have just been abandoned. There's the duck boarding, perfectly preserved. You know what I said about that panorama earlier on? You know, this is actually the archaeology. This is what's shown. This is all still there from the archaeological excavations at Messines Ridge. Carrying on, and we go to, there we go, a pickle helmet. Again, this was found at Messines Ridge. Also evidence from 1914 that they've identified a new battle. This is what I mean. You might think, why am I going on about another battle? And I'm thinking, well, that wasn't written about in the history. And this is in historical memory. Why did nobody write about it? Why are the archaeologists only finding it now? And those are actually stick grenades. It took me a while to work that out, but those are German stick grenades. Found excavated in the side of the trench. They're all stacked up, all these stick grenades. So this was a fortress for the Germans, and this is why the Allies wanted to take it. But there was another full year and 4 months to go before the war would end. This did not change the war. The Dig Hill 80, as I already mentioned, and has uncovered to date 200 bodies. And it say that now and then we're able to give them an answer, those relatives an answer to what happened to their loved ones in the First World War. And when we actually think about the findings, each of those little things adds a little bit more to the people that fought in the First World War. So moving on a little bit more, and you know everything that I've said, Jane, about a bomb dropping, and it sucks all the oxygen out of the air, and basically that creates a vacuum, and the trenches collapse. This is what's going on here, and anyone there is going to be squashed or pulverized. And these are really well built trenches. But to give you an idea of trenches, to give you a comparison, this is a trench from the Allied side, and this is mechanical warfare. And what's happening when you get to mechanical warfare, they think of ways of making life easier. So these are actually A-frames, and what it is, you would dig out the trench and you'd put these A-frames into the side of the trench, and you'd put the duck board in above. Hopefully there's going to be drainage below. But the biggest problem with this that archaeologists are finding is that not only because it's built below groundwater level, even if they've got drainage, if the trench takes a direct hit, the flow of water no longer flows, and then the trench fills up no matter what you do. These are actually rounds from excavated at Messines Ridge again. These are actually from one of the Spandau machine guns, that none of these bullets were actually fired. Again, lost after the explosions at Messines Ridge on that June the 7th. looking at this, the reason why I'm getting through this a bit more promptly is because I'm trying to get to a very quick article I want to look at, which answers one other question. And if we can get to it, I'll tell you what that question is. Again, more of the beautiful, hence they're saying that Messines Ridge is the First World War Pompeii. Tools, again, looking at the archaeology and the tools just left there. You've got a pick and you've got a spade. These were just left there in a moment. It's just a time capsule. Whoever put these down that day never saw these again because they were dead as well. This was part of that day's shift. They were put there as part of this day's shift. I've got two images to look at a minute. I'm showing you this image because this is actually the great-great-granddad of one of my boys that actually does my Young Explorers Club on a Wednesday. And he actually said, actually, I've got, and his name is Barford, I think. And he fought in the First World War, right? And you know what? Hairs went up on the back of my neck because he actually died at the Somme. And I'd only just been talking about that. This was one of the soldiers that fought for that very small stretch of land at the Battle of the Somme. And we give him tribute. We don't immortalize him. He's remembered for his sacrifice, with the hope that maybe we can learn that we should have an end to all wars. And what I'd like to do, I'd like to look at this article just briefly. I'm going to go on to it now, but we've seen two images today. One of a German lay in front, face down, and this combat soldier. He's a rifleman, and we can tell he's a rifleman because he's got these rounds laying in around in a little pocket on a belt, and it is I've forgotten the name for it anyway. It'll come to me at the end. So he's actually a rifleman because there's 5 bullets on a little spool, so he could fire 5 rounds without having to reload. And interestingly enough, there's his rifle, and there is actually his trenching tool. And this guy is just gone over the top, and he's taken a bullet, and it's killed him straight out. And he's just lying. This is Pompeii. He's lying in the moment, in the agony, his death throes of that very time in the First World War. And you can even see his shoes. I mentioned this thing about the rubber boots, evidence at Messines Ridge of rubber boots being found. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to go on to an article. I promise not to be too long. This sort of, this completes nicely this lecture. So hang on a minute. Can you all bear with me a minute? Jane, if you chat a minute, I've actually, strangely enough, lost this article. So I've got to type in what I typed in. Now the question was, I found it straight away. I thought, right, there's something I'm trying to remember. I was doing this on Monday. There's something I'm trying to remember. And I thought, what is it? What is really fitting for this lecture? All those German soldiers that were found buried, and they were found buried at a site in the south end at Kaspach, near the French Swiss border, and they found 21 Germans that were buried alive due to an explosion. And this was another Pompeii as well, another Pompeii at the Western Front. And I thought, what is this? I need to use this. And I found the article, and I was so pleased. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop my screen. I'm going to change my screen sharing a minute so you can see all these images as I go through them. So we're going to screen share anew. And Jane, are you seeing some wax being pulled out of somebody's ear? Maybe you You were
Not
there.
yet, no. You've
Now.
gone off at the moment. It's back.
It's back now?
Nope. Nope. Yeah, there it is, yeah.
There it is.
Yeah.
So this article I'm going to share with you all. I love this article. The Pompeii of the Western Front. Archaeologists find the bodies of, I don't want to keep saying that here, go away, of 21 tragic World War I German soldiers in perfectly preserved trenches where they were buried alive by an Allied shell. Men were killed when a huge Allied shell exploded above the tunnel at Kaspach on the French-Swiss border, causing it to cave in. Engineers find, hang on a minute, I'll keep that pop up. Engineers find trench network 18 feet beneath the surface of the town, 18 feet. And it's describing another scene like Pompeii. The bodies of 21 German soldiers entombed in a perfectly preserved World War I shelter have been discovered 94 years after they were killed. The men were part of a larger group of 34 who were all buried alive, so they managed to recover 13 of them, but the other 21 were left there. Some of them may have suffocated because they weren't dug out in time. So nearly a century later, and look, Jane, you've got to agree with me, but the archaeology of that trench on the right there is perfect. Look at it.
Yeah, unbelievable, isn't it?
It is unbelievable. The timbers there almost look as if you've just built it in the garden, you know?
Yeah.
The image on the left is as the trench collapsed. So this was not a normal trench. This was a covered trench. This was a subterranean network that took a direct hit. And actually, you know, when you go down to something like Blanavon and you go down the big pit and you see that, that looks like a mine on the left, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
It is so well preserved, and you've got all the metal working and everything there. Before we get to the caption, those are actually beds. On the right there, they're actually beds, and that's a German helmet. So, and the tragedy is that the soldiers were buried alive. They're finding all their personal objects, and I've just missed that one. That bottle there lying on the floor was probably held by the German just as the shell hit. A number of soldiers were discovered sitting upright on a bench, Jane. One was lying in his bed and another was in the fetal position, having been thrown down the stairs, all dead. Most of them shell-shocked. As well as the body's poignant personal effects such as boots, helmets, weapons, wine bottles, spectacles, wallets, pipes, cigarette cases, pocketbooks, and even newspapers with dates on have been found. So we've got 100 meters of trench here. It's a bit like Pompeii. Everything collapsed in seconds, and it's just the way it was at that time. The collapsed shelter was filled with soil. The items were very well preserved because of the absence of air, light, and water. Metal objects were rusty. Wood was in extraordinary great condition. And basically, they found a body at the bottom of these stairs here. Because the person had been going up the stairs and suddenly the shell fell and he'd thrown down the bottom of the stairs and he just died. And they've excavated all these, very clay-like. And some of the charred remains of the upper levels as the fire ravaged through the top timbers of the trench. And I actually thought this was, again, really poignant that you've actually got a German rifle and you've actually got a cup there, just left there in the moment. And what you're looking at now, Jane, is a German newspaper. It's just so well preserved. And rather interestingly, looking at all these other things, you've got an axe and you've got hammer. And if you actually look down here, rather interesting, you've got tongs, rather big tongs, that would have been used by a blacksmith within probably repairing equipment or something. So you got that there. And the amazing thing, Jane, is that all of the individuals, those 13 that they recovered and all the other 21, we can give them names, every single one of them. They all came from the 6th Company of the 94th German Reserve Infantry Regiment, with names like Musketeer Martin Hendricht and Private Henry Bergkamp and Lieutenant August Hutton, ranging between 20 to into their 40s. These have all been identified. Whenever any bodies are actually found in Germany, or France or Belgium, anywhere, the War Graves Commission comes in, and they basically said, well, you know, let's have a chat about this. Are they Germans? Do they need to be buried in Germany? Do they need to be buried here? And all the rest of it. Who are they? It's lucky that day that there weren't 500 men underground, because if the bomb had dropped and there'd been 500 men underground, they would have all died. This would have been a slaughter pit. And this was on the 18th of March, 1918, just a couple of months before the great German push that could have ended the war in favor of the Germans winning it, but that was not to be. They found telephone communication systems, beds, water pumps, all these other things. There's a German helmet there. And what we're showing here is the 100 meters of trench. So obviously all this area here where the cursor is, that's where they've been finding the bodies, all sort of sheltered over, perfectly preserved as they're excavating. And that there, you can see the holster, the leather holster. It's just so perfect. It's you know, the guy who held that, who touched that minutes before the explosion, and it just brings you back to these people as human beings and the memories, not as them and us, but who they actually are. A wooden shovel there. And as we get to the end now, the bell system for the communication in the trench, as they're excavating this wonderful set of archaeology, so that's going to carry some rounds in it. Again, moving on a bit more. And I thought this was rather interesting. This is a little bit of a knapsack with the person's food in it. And you can see the food there, and look at that there. It's almost as if there's a little tin of something in there, may have had meat in it. Amazing. You don't get this detail. And wonderful, Keith showed us earlier on a rifle, but this rifle has still got its wood associated with it. And again, there's Kaspach in the Swiss German border. So what I'd like to do, anyone who needs to look at these things on the internet yourself. So what we're going to do now, Jane, you've got the last say on this lecture. We're going to end on a very much lighter note than we did when we started off with. So I'm going to stop there. And it's in memory to the 21 that were recovered in that trench from this wonderful site. So Jane, have you got anything you'd like to say before everyone gets a say?
I'm sure everybody feels the same as me. When I normally think about the First World War and the Second World War as well, it's always little arrows on a map that come to mind, you know, with showing where the battles were and what have you. And it doesn't feel very personal. But looking at all this makes it so much more real and makes it seem, well, what we knew already, but it makes it very definitely. What a waste, what a total waste of lives on every side.
Yes.
And also the other thing that comes to mind is when you see the suffering that went on, it puts our position now into a different perspective, doesn't it? You know, we're being asked to socially distance and stay at home for a while, and making so much fuss about it. Not us personally, but a lot of people are making so much fuss about it. If they had to put up with going off to war and being in those trenches, it's a different matter altogether, isn't it?
And actually, I couldn't have concluded this lecture any better than that. That is perfect. I didn't mention much about the Spanish flu, but I will mention that the Spanish flu was caused because of the First World War. These men were in close proximation for four plus years. And most of the people who died of the Spanish flu were actually their age range. And it doesn't take an expert to work out that it was caused because of the First World War. And if there had never been a First World War, maybe 100 million lives could have been saved alone by not having the Spanish flu in the first place. So, you know, that's my analysis of it. So what we're going to do, thank you for that, Jane. That was a wonderful closing statement. And what we're going to do, I want, because I know some of you want to go, I would like to leave this to one sentence from everybody. Before you come on, I really appreciate this lecture today. Thank you very much for joining us. So let's have everybody on now. I've unmuted everybody. Just keep it brief. And who are we going to go first with? We'll start off with Sue. Anything you would like to say? And I need to speak to you at the end, Sue, as well. So stay behind. Anything from you, Sue?
Yeah. Well, it was just the futility of it, and reminded me so much of some of the great novels I've read, sort of Pat Barker, the Regeneration series, where the more personal angle is brought in against this sort of backdrop of total global madness.
Well, that's as good as it gets. Thank you for that, Sue. Right, so whoever's got their television on in the background, let's do them first. Oh, don't worry. Ellen, would you like to say something?
Yeah, it just brings it on a personal level, as Jane was saying. You know, it's similar to reading All Quiet on the Western Front and Diary of Anne Frank. You know, it's just awful, the horror and
Exactly. Thank you for that. What about Goff? Anything to say? No, I can't hear him. Never mind.
Can't hear you.
Right, Jim, you say your bit because we've got background noise with you.
Oh, okay. It's fascinating talk. Yeah, it's brilliant.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Jim. Keith, anything to say?
Not really, no. One good point or bad point, depending how you look at it. Women probably got the vote because of the First World War.
Let's look at that being positive. Karen, what would you like to say?
No, just that was very interesting. Say sort of brings home the people behind the statistics.
Yes, it does. Thank you for the and Chris.
It's made me realise that I don't know much about my own family's involvement in the First World War. I'd quite like to find out more.
and so you should. Pam, and you.
This brings it home, really. In East London, my stepmother, the bomb was coming down. They didn't have time to get to the shelter, and an American soldier threw her to the ground and laid on top of her to protect her. So we've done the away bit in the trenches, but that's what's going on at home as well. And it's courage, isn't it?
Courage, and I think is actually.
She liked that, by the way.
I'm sure she did.
That's what he said the reason was.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I bet.
I just like. Okay. Okay. The poignant point to make there is that you know, when after a while that everyone started to think it wasn't about them, it's actually about us. It's about us as humanity. I'm sure the Allies and the Germans were thinking that you know, at the end of this we've all got to be friends. We were friends before, and I'm actually friends at Christmas. This is about us. This is about all of us. And there are some records of great heroism on both sides, helping each other out, and I think that has to be remembered more than the absolute hatred that the First and the Second World Wars are remembered for. Heroism is about how you act with other people, not going out killing somebody. Rosamond.
I was just thinking of the irony when you said about the bullets being hammered into crucifixes. If you look at the sort of, the irony in that.
Yes, exactly.
Food for thought, that.
Exactly. And Goff, you have the last say on this today.
Yeah, it's just to put things in context. You know, my heritage is German, and my German grandfather was on the front in France fighting for Germany.
Why not?
He came back a left leg and a right arm, and my grandmother said that he was never the same man again.
Yeah, yeah.
I think, to be honest with you, that's put it home, hasn't it? So, thank you very much. Have you? I'm going to say, I'm not going to say the usual. Have you all enjoyed today? But have you all felt this worthwhile today? Yeah.
Yeah, very worthwhile. Yeah, very worthwhile.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure. So, just reminding, if anyone wants to join us tomorrow afternoon, I'll be sort of covering some issues that we've done today anyway. I'll see you all next week. That's great. And I'll keep you in touch. So I'm going to keep behind Sue and Rosamond. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Goff, Keith, Jim, Chris, Karen, Ellen, Jane, Rosamond.
Bye, everyone.
See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Daddy.
Bye-bye, son.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, son.
Everyone.
Oh, God, I'm sure that guy's got problems. Well, I thought I had problems as well. Right, so Sue and Rosamond, we'll just have a quick chat, and then I've got to lie down. Okay, I'm gonna stop that recording.